All right, so I would like to welcome everybody to what is actually the third annual Forum Disciplinary Landscape. It's also the first forum which actually takes place in this building, because before that, our first forum was actually organized when there was not even a school, but there was not even an idea of the school, but there was an idea that, well, let's have a forum and discuss disciplinarity, and maybe we use that to design the school, right? So our second critical thinking forum was squattered in the library, in the regional library, because we didn't have a building here. And here, finally, this is a normal forum. I think it's going to continue like that for the future. Now about the topic, right? So we have come up with this topic of critical thinking in academia today for several reasons. But the main reason, I think, is that critical thinking has become a kind of a buzzword that is usually invoked to validate the existence of liberal arts education. This is a kind of last resort when parents or for prospective students or employers attack liberal arts schools saying you don't teach your students necessary skills. They don't get a job after they graduate. They don't get a good job. At least it's better to study, IT, and then you get a professional job when you graduate from BA program, etc., etc. The last answer is, but at least we actually teach them critical thinking skills, and this is very important. This is something that is absolutely essential, and I always had some kind of problem with this because nobody defines critical thinking, right? It's kind of a last term, like freedom, right, or something like this. So I thought it would be good to get together very different people that do different things in universities and to discuss what critical thinking is actually all about. And do we still have to use critical thinking as the main goal of liberal arts education? Or maybe we can come up some updated version and maybe different name for some kind of general thing that is most essential in our education, right? So we get together here people who govern universities, govern colleges, people who teach in colleges or teach at School of Advanced Studies here, people who study higher education as a research topic, right? So we have all kinds of people. I think it's essential to have this mix to have a productive conversation. Now, in your programs, there are this preliminary list of topics that we are going to address. And these topics are also the reasons why we thought critical thinking is really important. So one thing is about historical development, right? This is an obvious question. Is critical thinking today the same as it was in the early 20th century or 50 years ago? Is there a kind of development of what critical thinking is, or is this some kind of essential, perennial quality of the mind that we should have just as people 50 years ago had to have it, or 100 years ago, I don't know, 1,000 years ago in Plato's time, right? And if it changes, I mean, then how it changes. Also, we are interested in the relationship between competing terms. So besides critical thinking, there is also critical thought, there is critique, there is criticism, and it's not clear how we actually draw the boundaries and what exactly we teach here. Another thing which I think is very important is the relationship between analytic techniques such as logic and argument analysis and critical thinking. Because if you look at the curriculum of many colleges, what they call critical thinking is just basic analytical thinking. And if this is the case, if actually when they say critical thinking, we mean just simple logic, right, and people just analyzing arguments in a good way, then we don't need liberal arts education. Actually, you go to some good science class, you could take a class in mathematical logic, you could take class in non-mathematical logic, and here you go, right? You can reason logically and see and analyze arguments. So is there any difference between critical thinking and other kind of types of scientific thinking, which is apparently important for it, but maybe it's not enough, right? So another thing that is here on the agenda is what happens with artificial intelligence. Apparently, thinking is no longer just only human thinking, as it was before when the idea of critical thinking first developed. So the question is, does artificial intelligence change it somehow? What is the impact, or what is going to be an impact when artificial intelligence is going to be all around? And connected question is, of course, different students. Students who live in digital world, students who watch video more than they read, students who make videos more than they read, etc., etc. So these students are very different from the students before. They think differently. Does it mean that we still have to put them back in the 19th century kind of culture in a college? and really teach them critical thinking as people used to do 100 years ago. I don't know, right? So this, I think, is an important issue to discuss, right? And another topic that was suggested by Denise, I don't know if he's going to talk about it himself or not, is the lessons from psychology and cognitive science and how they can help us understand critical thinking now. So there is some kind of scientific base now which we can use to analyze thinking, right? We can see how the brain works when it thinks. And maybe we can actually draw on that material to really understand critical thinking better, right? So instead of just reading Plato, you just put the person in a machine, you know, put some electrodes and see where the deficiencies in the thinking are, and then you correct that with medical and other surgical maybe means, right? Okay, so now about our format. Based on ours and other conferences' bad experience of extremely boring sessions when people come up and read their papers, we decided that for critical thinking in academia today and for disciplinary landscape forum in general, we get rid of paper presentations altogether. We will not read papers here. You can read papers in the library, right? You can actually, you know, distribute your papers. We invited everybody who wanted to share some text. Do that. Hope some of us actually read it. But now we are going to have a much more colloquial, much more conversational debate. But I think conversational doesn't mean that's kind of more lighthearted. So we kind of just relax and just imagine this is a dinner party which is just runs all day long, right? So we still want some structure. We begin with the roundtable. In the roundtable, everybody on the program will be given a chance to speak. We said like 5-7 minutes. I know that Isaac actually asked for 15 minutes because he has a presentation to show, and I said okay, so because maybe, I mean, probably it's going to be very interesting for us. But generally, it's like kind of 5-7 minute talk and questions and conversations that go like that. What is the goal of this roundtable? The goal of this roundtable, in terms of the organization of the conference, of the forum, is to come up with 3 topics that is going to be studied in detail by the teams, by the groups, that we divide after this roundtable, after lunch. So after lunch, we come up with 3 topics. People divide in 3 groups. They work for a couple of hours with the team and prepare a presentation about a particular topic, right? So when we do this roundtable, let's try to formulate the issues which you think are most pertinent for this particular audience, for this particular interests that we have here, so that we work on them today after lunch and also tomorrow before lunch, right? So tomorrow we are going to have another intersection because today in the evening, all the teams are going to present what they have come up with these topics. We will discuss that in the plenary session, we will criticize them, and tomorrow we will give them a chance to have another go, right? To kind of revisit this topic, taking into account the conversation today in the evening, and come up with the kind of final presentations. This final presentation should then seamlessly translate into the open panel that we are going to have here at 3 o'clock tomorrow, when, unlike in these days, we are going to have a simultaneous translation into Russian, and we invited the whole university here pretty much, right? So yeah, so it's going to be a larger audience, I think, than today, although today it's unexpectedly bigger, actually, than I thought, which is good. And we are going to actually communicate something to the university, right? Taking this university as just one example of universities who want to change. So there should be some kind of practical implications from what we've discussed over a day and a half, right? Okay, and that's it. And also tomorrow after that, Isaac is going to give a lecture about human capital 2.0. But I don't know, I think it's going to be in Russian, right? So not all of us are going to be, but those who do speak Russian are welcome to Isaac's lecture as well. Do you have any questions about the program, about how we work? Okay. All right, so we don't have a sequence, right? So we don't have a sequence of like first or alphabetical or somehow. So I just invite somebody who thinks their presentation is the best to start with, just volunteer and to say, yeah, I want to start the conversation, come here and speak for 5-7 minutes about your take on critical thinking. Isaac, do you think we can start with your presentation because you are the longest? Yeah.
Okay. Colleagues, it's my great pleasure to be here.
Does it work?
Yes, yes, yes. I told my hosts that I grew up and spent most of my career in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, and I always thought that Tyumen is much more remote place and than Krasnoyarsk, which is 4.5 hours flight from Moscow. And so I realized with a great surprise that Tyumen is much closer to Moscow, which is nice news for me. And I'm always happy to be at this university. I know that that's one of the most dynamic universities, and frankly speaking, as a person who is interested in higher education innovations, I'm particularly interested in the School of Advanced Studies. And yesterday at the big Senate meetings at High School of Economics in Moscow, we discussed approaches to the new strategy of HSC, and I have to admit that one of our vice rectors told to the Senate that even in Tyumen they opened kind of liberal arts college, and we are still behind. Yeah, so that's a good thing. I don't think that my presentation is best for the introduction, but maybe it can work because I'm not going to tell about how I understand critical thinking. The slogan of, not the slogan, but the focus of our Institute of Education is empirical knowledge in education. So we, unfortunately, we are not very strong in educational theories. We leave it for the Russian Academy of Education and Moscow State University. We are trying to look at the reality, and sometimes, again, I'm really looking forward to hear ideas of clever people, intelligent people, what is critical thinking. I will tell you about 3 projects that our institute is implementing around critical thinking. Very briefly, and then you can learn more during informal meetings, etc. So, could you help me to switch it on? Yeah, there are 3 projects that we currently are working in. Yes. And so not all of them are in area of higher education. In fact, I start with the project in area of, it also doesn't work? Yeah, could you check it, please? Yeah. Okay, I will tell you. So, in fact, the critical, yes, thank you. So, the first project is creativity and critical thinking, and it's a big international project conducted by Organization of Economic and Social Development, OECD. 15 countries participate there, and the idea is to enrich tasks for school students, not curriculum, not changing textbooks, but to change tasks that students dealing with at their lessons, to develop their creativity and critical thinking. The interesting focus of this project, that creativity goes in the framework, in the theoretical framework, goes together with critical thinking. And they base on their understanding of creativity and critical thinking on the so-called Delphi report 30 years ago already. And the main components of critical thinking are analysis, evaluation, conclusion, explanation. They also include self-regulation and self-correction. In fact, I will share the presentation with all of you. No need to photo that. And why they put together critical thinking and creativity? Because they think that creativity as the personality, almost as a personality trait like curiosity, sustainable interest, is a driver of the critical thinking. You cannot think critically if you are not creative. That's, again, that's not my opinion. It's how the project understands that. So in 11 countries, we have control and intervention groups, and the intervention is to change the tasks that students dealing with in 3rd and 8th grade, and we have 50 classes in Moscow, and work in math and science. So we are trying, our researchers trying to change traditional tasks into something more interesting that requires critical thinking. For example, students are asked to design their own artworks and discuss these artworks, and also they use it to understand the idea of area. That's mathematics and creativity. Another example of the tasks, and tasks are developed by our researchers together with teachers to choose, that's a very simple task, to choose from a set of photos, negative climatic events, those that happens in Russia, really exist, and to find the protection from this negative event. So that's, again, that's just an example of an interesting project, and we have what probably the most difficult thing is to create assessment rubrics for students, and they have, I don't like this classification, passive doer, initiator, and strategist expert. You know, if you're talking about 3rd graders, it's a bit too strong. But still, you know, many teachers just, when they think about the student as an expert, it changed their perception, and they have to deal with the student differently. So the preliminary results are very interesting. They really show that if you do that, it improves the result. So that's an experiment, and you see that indeed we have this, if you have an intervention, you have a growth in critical thinking. The second project is more theoretical, and I'm very proud with that. We were asked by biggest Russian bank, Sberbank, by their foundation, to make some clarity in the discussion about key competences. Because the president of this bank, Russians know him well from media, German Gref, told a year ago that when he tried to listen experts from education, what are the key competences? After this conversation, he told it's terrible mess. So he wanted to have some clarity, and we called together some best schools of education around the world. You see the list from University College of London, that's school number 1 in the world, Ontario, Peking, Warsaw, Boston, Helsinki, Seoul. And the idea of this consortium was to develop a coherent framework for key competences. And frankly speaking, we didn't invent, so that's, and we also tried to understand what is a competence, what is a literacy, and why I decided to inform you about this project, because we realized that we analyzed together with, in this consortium, more than 120 different frameworks around key competences. And what we found that it's probably useless to talk about very detailed, specific competences and create and discuss, do we have 9 of them or 12, et cetera, et cetera. We see that more and more strong meta-analysis lead us to very simple 3 parts picture, which includes the set of competences or skills related to thinking and reasoning, interpersonal competences or skills. I don't want to get into the discussion what is the difference, and intrapersonal. In fact, the last block is particularly interesting because we often underestimate it, but for our discussion, I think that thinking and reasoning as one of 3 major blocks is probably very important. I leave literacies out. If you are interested, I can tell you later. And the last project, very briefly, it's called Supertest. We do it together with Stanford University and Tsinghua University. And it's a very ambitious project, I have to admit, very expensive. And we are trying to understand the quality of engineering education in 3 countries, Russia, China, and US. We have representative samples of universities in each country, and we are trying to assess skills over time. We already have data from the first year and the third year. And we measure both professional skills, not academic, it's not correct here. For example, in electrical engineering, we measure specific skills, and in computer engineering also, we measure computer science and math. But we also measure high-order skills, critical thinking. We use critical thinking test developed by Education Testing Service in the States. And it includes, again, it's similar to what I had in the previous slides, 5 components: evaluate and use data, analyze and evaluate the arguments, understand, formulate arguments, and understand cause-effect relations and explanations or interpretations. And the results are striking. I would ask not to quote them because we just sent the paper to one of the leading journals, but the temptation to share is strong. This task is in Russian, and again, the presentation will be available. You can look at that. So it includes facts and arguments, and you have to evaluate the arguments. So what are the results? First, it says grades, I mean years, and that's, in critical thinking, it's very interesting. You see that in Russia, initial level of critical thinking among graduates, among students of first years, is low, significantly lower than in China. We explain it very simply. China has only 8% of age cohort in the sample, within our sample, and we have 20%. Our sample is from 20% of the age cohort. But what's interesting that the gains in Russian universities are, at least they exist, and in China, the level of critical thinking declining. In fact, our Chinese counterparts explain that because by the dominance of the rote learning in Chinese universities. So, in fact, US students also make some gains in critical thinking. So that's it, and I just, again, wanted to show that critical thinking is not just a theoretical concept. It could be measured, assessed, and understood as an important outcome of higher education. Thanks.
Thank you, Isak. But from that Russian example of a question, right, in that test, that looks like a standard GRE question, right, graduate record examination, which tests analytical thinking and argument analysis. So this is what you understand in this project by critical thinking, analysis of arguments, or not?
Again, we had to use a valid test. And the most respected test was at that time ETS test on critical thinking, and ETS was behind GRE at some point, so obviously there are links. But in fact, this test is relatively new, so we cannot say that it's, you know, outdated understanding of critical thinking. At least mainstream US testing agency understands critical thinking as analytical thinking, and evaluation of the argument is the main part of that.
Thank you. All right. Who wants to follow up? Who thinks the intervention is somehow linked to this? Or on the country is completely different, right? So we have a kind of right way, the whole scope of who's least empirical here? Okay.
So that was a small excerpt from John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. And it's an illustration, or it's meant to be an illustration, of what I think we need to be teaching ourselves and our students in a world that is increasingly dominated by IT and artificial intelligence. And the main question for me as I'm running a university and trying to figure out what I should be teaching students is, what are they going to be having to do over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years? Because my students today will, at least in principle, still be of working age, assuming there is such a thing as working age 40 years from now. And the skills or things I think that we should be teaching them are very closely related to that piece by John Cage. The first point I want to make is competing with AI and computers by attempting to do the same thing is obviously a waste of time. So insofar as computers have the advantage of doing things incredibly quickly, we have to assume that if we have an advantage, it's doing things slowly. It can't be trying to do things faster than computers. That is obviously a dead end. It's doing what our students find most difficult to do, and I think all of us these days find most difficult to do, and which John Cage reminds us of, is to slow down and pay attention and think as broadly as we can, because the one thing we can be relatively sure about is that the things that computers currently are the best at doing are are narrow tasks that can be relatively easily turned into an algorithm. The hardest thing for them to do are the most broad-ranging tasks that have the highest level of unexpected contingent factors. Now, of course, 40 years from now, it's possible that computers will be able to do everything we can do and do it better than we can. But I can't prepare my students for that moment. When that happens, all bets are off. We don't need people anymore, and I have no job. But by then, well, who knows? In any case, there's nothing I can do about it. So I'm trying to prepare students for the next 10 or 20 years, let's say. And that's where this concept or idea of thinking, and to me, I'm not really sure there's any difference between critical thinking and thinking, where thinking comes in. And what I mean by thinking here is the ability to synthesize, to put the unexpected together, to see things that you wouldn't necessarily see, even big data wouldn't necessarily see, or you wouldn't necessarily think to ask big data to do, because of course, big data searches only work if somebody asks the search to happen in some way, or at least looks at what the search that was done and tries to pull things out of it. So I would like my students to be try this one. This one works. All right. And what I would like, what I'm trying to teach them to do is find answers to problems that don't have answers. Because to me, that's the single most important thing that we can do. Anything where there is an answer, or where someone thinks what you need to do is find the answer, is less important to me than areas where people are aware that there is no single answer. And that's where my students have to do their thinking. So it's not a question of is there critical thinking in science or mathematics. Of course there is critical thinking in science and mathematics, but it's much more difficult, I think, to do critical thinking in science and mathematics at the level of university education, BA education. Because there's still an expectation that they're learning things that probably have an answer, even if they recognize that at some point in the future the answer will turn out to be the wrong answer, but still there is an answer. Whereas in the kinds of areas that some of us work in, humanities and some social sciences, we know from the start there's no answer, which is helpful, I think, in this regard. And finally, at the same time, we're trying to teach our students to be able to do something because someone said something about getting them jobs, or that's what, so supposedly there's this idea that liberal arts doesn't get them jobs, or thinking doesn't get them jobs, but being able to do something gets them jobs. I think that's actually correct. Being able to do something does help them get jobs, and I don't see any contradiction between teaching them how to do something and teaching them how to think. They may not be the same thing. That is, the two things may be separate enterprises, but there's no reason they can't work together or in tandem. As I think all of us do, the way we find things out about the world is we ask people who are young because they know more than we do. So I was just talking to my 24-year-old son the other day, and he just finished a nice liberal arts education in Japanese and physics at Tufts University. And he said, the only thing I wish is that I had done some computer program because then I could get a job. But I wouldn't change my education at all. I would have just added 1 or 2 courses in computer programming so I can easily get a job, and then I can think. And to me, that's a pretty good combination. I don't see in the university that I run that there's any contradiction between training students for the next 10 years to do something and also training them to think so that when their job disappears, they'll have some idea of what to do going forward. Thank you.
We can actually ask questions, right? This is not a,
You can ask questions.
Does anybody have a question to Andrew?
Everyone is stunned into silence.
Yes. Yeah. We need to use mics all the time, I'm sorry.
My name is Irina Pluzhnik. I'm from the Institute of State and Law, Deputy Director for International Links. I'm very much interested in critical thinking, but don't you think that calling it like that, we emphasize the process but not the outcome? Don't you think that within academia it's better to speak about critical thinking skills or competences? Also, concentrating on the upcoming or prospective purposes, like in 10 or 20 years. What are we going to do right now? How can our students, find the right orientation in present reality? That's the question.
Okay, I think what I end up with is exactly what I would say about that. That is, our students do have to be able to do something in the present. And that something, in most cases, has to be something that someone will hire them to do, or they can convince someone to hire them to do. So it's true, they have to, more than in the past, students have to create their own jobs. They have to go and convince somebody to hire them because they can do an unusual combination of things. It's our job to give them the framework for that unusual combination of things. So I think, relatively soon, and already in many interesting places, nobody puts a job advertisement and says, we want to find someone who can do the following 3 things. You go to them and say, I can do these things and you need me because I see why what I can do will benefit you. Right? That's how I see smart 21-year-olds and 22-year-olds getting jobs. They're not sitting around waiting for someone to put out a job advertisement. So if we give them a feeling that they can put things together in an unusual and interesting way, they have lots of opportunities. If they can't put things together in an interesting and unusual way, I think more and more they're going to have no opportunities. And it doesn't really matter whether what they're doing is something that's supposedly useful or what's supposedly useless, because I think those categories are not really relevant. So to say, I will train an accountant, let's say, if that accountant can only do the things that other accountants can do, they're going to be roboticized out of existence within 3 or 4 or 5 years. So there's no reason to train that person. By the time they're finished, what they can do won't be useful to anybody. So the concept of doing something useful isn't necessarily a very useful concept, right? I need to teach them a combination of things that are useful and things that they think are useless, but they will be able to put together in a way that is interesting and unusual. In terms of the first question, again, I don't really know. I don't care what we call it. It doesn't matter whether we call it critical thinking skills. I just want them to be able to think. Very few people can do it. So I don't care what we call it. And I don't care whether you think it's skills or you think it's an ability or you think it's knowledge. You put them in positions where they have to do that kind of broad analytic thinking you want them to do. There's a huge number of different ways you can put people in that position. And I'm not necessarily a specialist in education to say, this is the right way to do it. I can see lots of different ways that you can put your students in an uncomfortable position and make them think their way out of it. That's all I care about, is making them uncomfortable, putting them in a position that's outside their comfort zone, and making them think through to something that gives them some level of temporary stability in the world. If they can do that, and if they've done it on multiple occasions and in multiple ways, when it happens again, which is going to happen again many times in their life, they might be able to deal better with it. That's all I can do.
But Andrew, I think if you really put it all together into this undefined category of thinking, we are not going to move anywhere, right? And I think you actually made a clear distinction between the type of thinking that is looking for the right answer, and that's good in sciences. And that is something, by the way, that Isaac was talking about, because if you look at the test example, that's looking for the right answer. There is one right answer. What is the implication of this or that argument, etc., presuppositions? And something that you're talking about is not that. And for that, you need humanities as opposed to science, right? So it's not that you can actually add some practical skill. You can actually teach students think this way or the opposite way. And helping them to think creatively is not going to help them think analytically. That's what actually we discovered at the School of Advanced Studies. Our students are too creative in a sense that they can make a fun presentation, come with an unexpected idea, they cannot analyze a simple argument. This is a problem, right? I mean, you cannot say, well, you know what, thinking is so broad, it's so well defined, we just teach them to think, also teach them to do something, they will be fine. You either teach them to think analytically or you don't. You either teach them to think creatively or you don't. And you cannot do that all at the same time because they're different things, you don't have enough time in college, right? So you have to, you can say, well, there is one, you have to teach them STEM and you have to teach them humanities. That would be a standard approach, right? They have to be actually analytical, know how to do calculations and physics and programming. And I don't think, I mean, I think your son is mistaken if he thinks that 2 classes in programming will get him a good job. All these tasks have already been automatized. If you have to get a decent job in programming, you need a couple of years of severe training. Otherwise, you don't get a job, right? You will learn something about programming, but you don't get a job.
Well, I mean, I think there are many holes in that particular argument. So the first hole is, I mean, look, nobody really thinks that people who are making discoveries in science fields aren't doing the same kind of creative thinking that people making discoveries anywhere else are doing. So that's just a false dichotomy. The question is, what do students do? So the problem in the sciences, at least the way we tend to teach the sciences, is there's a much longer lead time of learning how to do things before you're allowed to get to the point where you do something creative, right? So it's not that, you know, senior physicists don't think creatively. I'm sure that senior physicists and biologists who are doing interesting work think creatively. The question is, what do their students do and when do they start to do it and how does that actually happen? And I don't really know the answer to that because I've never worked in those kinds of laboratories where they're training such people. But I do know that what we do with undergraduate students, or the vast majority of undergraduate students in those fields, is not that. I don't know that we couldn't do that with them. Again, I'm not a specialist in teaching science. There's probably ways that you could undercut the finding the right answer mode. But most people don't even try. So given that they don't try, and given that that we don't think that's necessary, most of us don't seem to think it's necessary who teach that, yes, I agree, it's better to let them do the kind of thinking that happens in our classes in the humanities, because there at least we know there's no right answer, and so we don't start by assuming that there is. I mean, I knew someone who started medical school and they were told on the first day of medical school, look, 50% of what we teach you is going to turn out to be wrong, but since we don't know which 50% it is, we're going to teach it all to you as if it's right. You know, that's probably true because they don't know which 50% is going to turn out to be wrong, but they have to assume that what they know is currently correct. And you know, we don't start that way in literature classes. We would say, you know, 100% of what we teach you is wrong and also right, and so do something with it, right? So that's I think that's a different approach to teaching undergraduate students. To say though that you can't teach them something useful, i.e. something that will get them work, and useless, in quotation marks, simultaneously, I don't think that's correct. And I don't think that it's true that you have to be an expert programmer, let's say. I mean, again, you have to be able to do certain kinds of things and understand how people are putting things together and look for the right people to do things. And the only way you can do that is if you understand enough of what they're doing. So to just say, oh, we're going to train these, you know, nice liberal thinking people who have no skills is completely irresponsible. I mean, I can't imagine anything more irresponsible than that. It may be true that 40 years from now, they'll be the only ones who survive. But between now and 40 years from now, they're going to starve to death and they won't survive. So you have to do, I mean, if you're running a university, which I am, you can't say, oh, we're just going to do one and we're not going to do the other. That just, to me, is abdicating your responsibility as a university leader or as someone thinking about what education should look like.
Very simple question. You are starting new university, or not new university, but you start the transformation of old university. What place you are going to give to the teaching critical thinking, and in what forms, or thinking in general?
So it's not such a simple question, but it's a perfectly good question. I think my answer to that question has been to first of all transform the first year curriculum of the university, which is what we're going to start next year, because that's the easiest place. I mean, you get students who come. Yes, they come from the general high school curriculum of a post-Soviet country, so they're not tabula rasa, but at least they have no real idea of what's expected of them in university. So if you change the expectations from the get-go, that's the best way to go about it. And so given that we have these общеобразовательные requirements, to me, the easiest thing to do is to turn the общеобразовательная программа into a program that actually requires somebody to think. Now, this has come as terrible news to those people who currently teach the общеобразовательная программа, because it's never occurred to them that thinking could actually occur in that program. So I'm bending their minds at the moment and bringing in a bunch of new people to work with some of the old people, and we'll see whether the old people are capable of having their minds bent or not. I mean, the students' minds are relatively easy to bend. The faculty's minds are significantly more difficult to bend. But again, I think if you give them some things to do, I was at this conference that was organized at the Faculty of Liberal Arts at SPGU in, when was that conference, Denise? It was in June, April, whatever, yeah, April. And there was this guy from Stanford there who was talking about a program that they've put together at Stanford for making science students think. Which turns out to be much more difficult than you would expect. But anyway, he talked about this program, and the most important thing about the program was getting them to do something. And so that's what I've been trying to figure out in this new first-year program, is how to get my students to actually imitate doing the kinds of things that people in these fields do, even though they're not necessarily going to go into these kinds of fields. So the most interesting assignment that I've thought of, so one of the things we have to teach them is history, for example, which of course historically has been just learning a pile of names and dates and facts that are completely worthless. So I said, all right, well, how can we make them at least understand what does a historian do, right? How do you actually get a bunch of first-year students who aren't going to be historians to do that? So we came up with this nice assignment, which we're going to try with the students, which is they all have to find out and write a paper on what happened on my birthday. So I was born 18 years ago, whatever it was, 17 years ago. I have to actually go and dig out from somewhere. It could be an internet archive, it could be a physical one, a bunch of newspapers or whatever, the stuff that happened on my birthday, and I have to write it up and put it together in some kind of way. It's not a project you can easily steal from the internet, right? I mean, you actually have to go and do it. And you have to pretend for a little while you're a historian, and I think in general students like to do that, but it then requires them to synthesize, put things together, go look for something, figure out what the materials might look like. If you can do more projects like that, you can get them to think a little bit more. And again, I'm not trying to create a utopia. I'm not trying to create. I mean, this is not a humanities university. This is not a little experimental project like this wonderful one here in UTMN. This is an actual big university with lots of students, none of whom are interested in critical thinking in any way, shape, or form when they get there, or very few of whom know that they're interested in that. So the question is to sort of get them to do it without them entirely realizing that that's what they're doing, and try to get them to start down that path, and then see how far we can develop that path over the course of 4 years that I have them have their minds under my control in some way, shape, or form.
All right. I think we have to thank Andrew and move on. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it works. Even in the Russian language, to think about critical thinking is a huge challenge for me. But to discuss and to think it in English language make me crazy. Absolutely crazy. I don't know how I will survive in the next couple of days, but I will try to do my best. First of all, I would like to thank you, Andrei. It's my personal attitude. Why is it? Because a year and a half ago, Valery Falkov, me and Andrei, start like an easy discussion. It will be nice to organize something like critical thinking discussion here. And after that, I forget about this. And Andrei keep all this period of time his leadership. And finally, we have some people together and we will try to discuss this complicated topic. That's why thank you for your leadership, Andrei, at this point. And my point, my angle, my attitude to this topic is not coming from the discussion about liberal arts education and curriculum. And for me, critical thinking, first of all, and at this point I agree with Andrew, critical thinking for me, it's at the initial stage, it's synonymous of thinking in general. But I would like in this couple of days differentiate it from, let's say, science thinking or science attitude, from engineering attitude, or different type of thinking, different type of attitude as well. But once again, I'm in a risky situation. I try to put my definition or notion how I understand thinking at this particular moment. For me, it's the ability to create a new world with intention to make it practical, to implement what you created. I understand it's a narrow understanding, but I would like to put this kind of definition or attitude or notions for our discussion. It's keep inside to create a project, program, model, conception, and all these kind of intermediate ideas to make it possible to implement sooner or later. That's my attitude to critical thinking. And the last point in this initial statement is that for me, in this critical thinking in academia today, for me, critical thinking inside of or for academic institution today is more important. I believe that Russian universities, not only in Russia, but in Russia first of all, should rethink, redesign, reorganize, reshape their structure to afford to give the place for critical thinking inside. They need to be totally redesigned, I believe. That's my attitude to this topic and my intention to be part of this discussion from this kind of angle point of view. Thank you.
Anyone wants to ask a question to this? All right, but short one, please. Yeah.
Andrei Evgenich. Okay. The question is that...
Because we're in the English language, you can say me just Andrei.
Andrei, okay, that's great. Thanks. You have mostly concentrated on the contents of the term thinking, which is really great. But I'm sure that you know that the constituents of thinking process have been defined decades and decades ago, and they're absolutely universal and include such things as identification, generalization, analysis, synthesis, differentiation, and putting forward ideas. From this point of view, you're absolutely right. Thinking, well, I think that any human being can think, no matter whether he or she is in academia or not. Don't you think that we should mostly concentrate on the notion of the word critical? It sounds a little bit, I would say, dubious, because critical, that means also important, very important, but critical. What is critical? Because thinking is a too general notion which anyone possesses to a certain extent. That's the question. How would you define critical here in this
To answer this question at this particular moment is beyond my ability. Definitely
so there is a way
beyond.
to perfection, yeah?
But once again, at this particular moment, for me, critical, it's the same like thinking. So, in other words, I don't believe thinking is possible without critical attitude. That's a very simple statement I would like to say. Once again, I would like to differentiate it, and Andrei made this point 10 minutes ago. I would like to differentiate it from different type of thinking or intellectual technique or intellectual tools like engineering thinking or science thinking, and so on and so forth. But once again, even in Russian language, it's so difficult to discuss this topic, and I would like to be a small student in this kind of discussion to be relevant for type of this notion building, which we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrei, may I?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think what we can get from this discussion is this conjunction between thinking, quote unquote, critical thinking, and creation. Because Andrew said something about it, Andrei said something about it, right? So I think that's extremely problematic connection. Like yesterday, we heard a number of presentations made by high school students who were in the summer school here. Some of them created the worlds. They created computer game worlds with a lot of characters. They were cute. There was absolutely nothing critical about that. There was a little thinking involved. So creation is the kind of, that's what contemporary children do all the time. They just put together in various applications, all various details, they create something new. So if they say, well, this is the thinking that we are talking about, I think we are actually losing something. To create, I mean, this comes to the mythology of romanticism, of this kind of genius who creates out of the void or out of his internal or her internal, soul, this new world, which is the Earther, etc., etc. I think this mythology is pretty vulnerable to critique, so to speak, right? And if you get rid of that, then, okay, there is engineering thinking, which we can define, I think, somehow, right? There is scientific thinking, which we can also define. And there is this thinking which is none of this. And then we define critical thinking in this negative manner, right? We kind of say, well, it's a thinking which is not all these other thinkings which we know about. And, maybe we can actually move towards the more positive definition. So I think you wanted to say, to be the next, right? Oh, all right.
So, no, I can just go ahead and present. I think that's easier if that's rather than ask a question.
Integrate your comment into the presentation,
Yeah.
right? All
Okay. So I have some images. Would it be possible to just put the first slide up? Let me see if and this is the way to change it. Okay, so let me, I did actually want to say something about maybe starting to think about this notion of critical specifically as opposed to just, as opposed to thinking. So maybe I'll just introduce this by saying I teach at Bard College Berlin, which is a very small liberal arts college that's entirely based on discussion seminars, discussion usually among a relatively small number of students. So to a large extent, I think my thinking about liberal arts and about how we might want to discuss critical thinking comes directly from that experience. So what I want to share, and very briefly, has to do with maybe the experience of a liberal arts seminar and what that might mean for that kind of education and the critical thinking component of it. So my main sort of overall thought about this, which I would like to relate to a painting that I will speak about in a second, has to do with, I would describe, if I had to find a word to describe what I think that we're doing, what I and students are doing in a discussion seminar, the word that comes to mind first is interpretation. So I would tend to think of critical thinking as maybe a component of interpretation, which also involves other kinds of interactions. If I were, maybe this would be oversimplifying a bit, but I would say if there were two principal aspects to what I think happens in an interpretive encounter with a text or a work of art and with the other people in the discussion, I think one component is what we could call critical thinking, or what I might want to call reflection. And another component is something like receptivity. And this is something I think is very different. So by receptivity, I don't mean something passive, I mean something like active receptivity. For instance, if you're discussing a text together for a significant amount of time, a big part of that, I would say sustained engagement with the text or with the work of art involves trying to understand what's there, sort of being receptive and open to what the text is offering, and then that may be, for me, is just as important a component of this interpretive activity as the critical part, which involves analyzing, reflecting upon what's there, and taking some distance from it. And I also would say that the same kind of doubleness of the process, one is being sort of actively receptive, let's say a good listener or a good viewer, and the other part being analytically responsive, is also true for the way students interact with each other. So I think of it in the same way, like how students may respond to each other's comments or to what the professor is offering, is also involving these different aspects of interpretation. And the reason I wanted to just briefly share this image by Peter Bruegel the Elder, because this is, first of all, this is a work that I do teach. So this is the kind of thing that you could, just as much as say a text by Plato, this is the kind of thing you could spend a significant time discussing and interpreting with students in a liberal arts context, but also because this particular painting thematizes the problem of interpretation. And I think you could say, along with that, the problem of critical thinking. In other words, I think with any great work of art, of course, we want to engage in this way, but this work actually explicitly asks us to consider this problem. So just to point out what I mean, first, this is a large panel painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder from 1564, and it's got something like 500 figures in it, and if you look, the subject matter may not be evident right away. It's the carrying of the cross. It's Jesus carrying the cross up to Calvary. And the first thing you notice is the variety of responses. Jesus is in the center of this picture. This lower image shows, sorry, let's see if I can get this. There we go. This lower image just shows the detail. So the picture sets up the problem of interpretation first by showing so many different responses to the event, an event which we may assume has a certain meaning. Let's say from a Christian context, it has a very important meaning. But within the world of the painting, a lot of the figures are either not interested or are looking at it with some kind of mockery or with some kind of emotional engagement or with critical thought. So the range of responses right away raises the problem of interpretation, right? There may not be one meaning, one known meaning of this event. And just to point out a few of these, I just very quickly, so we don't spend too much time. You have areas like in the lower right foreground, which is probably representing the Virgin Mary and other figures from Christ's time, clearly an emotional response, a kind of grieving. But you also have at a very prominent position near the top of the painting, this bizarre mountain with a windmill on top. And at that spot of that windmill, there's actually, not sure. There were, yeah. Oh, so here are some more slides just showing the different responses to the event. Upper right are the people attending the execution, very much set up like a contemporary social context of the Netherlands. Some of them seem clearly to be enjoying themselves. But what I wanted to get to is this figure. If you look closely, you can see there's a little guy up there by the windmill who's looking down at the event from above. This might, I mean, roughly speaking, we might say this is the position of critical thinking, or what I would want to call a kind of reflective detachment. Because here you can see that, first of all, he has a vantage point high up so he can see everything. But he also has this, this procession turning around. He's like at the center of a circle. The procession is turning around him. It gives him the option of seeing, say, just one option, seeing Jesus as the center of this event, or as just one point on a circumference, which involves a lot of other things happening, right? So this is the skeptical part, perhaps, of reflective, critical thinking. On the right side of the passage, one other thing I want to point out, maybe two other details, and then I'll stop. On the right side, there are two figures. You can see in the detail on the right there, right at the edge behind this this execution, then contemporary means of execution on this pole with a wheel on top. So they're behind it. The one in the white with the red hat is almost always identified as a self-portrait. So there's possibly the painter stepping back, looking critically, looking reflectively at the event, interpreting as we're being asked to interpret. But right next to him is a figure who's clearly grieving and leaning against the tree, obviously receptively taking in the emotional and perhaps spiritual significance of the event, of the execution that he's witnessing, the execution of criminals and also of Christ. I would want to see this, so this kind of like as an emblem of the way I'm thinking about interpretation and the role of critical thinking in it. I think of this as a kind of dialectical pair. They're really, for me, both self-portraits. In other words, the two can't be separated. You have the critical response and you have the receptive, emotional, intuitive encounter, and that these two are somehow codependent, right, and placed there together as different, not mutually exclusive ways to respond to what's being presented. So I would see this as a kind of emblem of what I would like to happen in a liberal arts classroom, which is this combination of what we might call critical thinking and an intuitive, personal, receptive engagement with the works that we're discussing and with the other people in the room who are discussing it with us. Maybe one last point about interpretation. Among the many figures you can see here in this foreground are the group of mourning figures again. Behind them you can see all sorts of different responses. Some are looking at them, some are gesturing to turn around and look at Jesus. Some are curious, some are sad. And then you have this little guy in the river there who doesn't seem to be doing much of anything. Bruegel's paintings are full of figures like this. And this figure, it's painted in such a way, it sort of looks like he might be reaching out to his friend, the one in the gray. He might be looking at something in his hand. He might be moving, he might not. It's really indeterminate. And this is important too, because in this broader picture of interpretation that Bruegel is offering, indeterminacy is included, meaning questions that we can't answer. We can't know what that figure is doing, no matter how long we look. And the uncertainty of meaning is very important, not only for understanding the painting, but maybe for engaging the world in a certain way, which I think liberal arts can help us with, in this sort of open and, let's say, indeterminate way. Okay, maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Dara. You have a question? I want to be the next to talk. All right. Let's limit ourselves to 2 questions, right? Because we don't have time.
Okay, so you said that the guy on top, the one near the windmill, is in the best position for critical thinking. So, but if we look at him closely, we see that he's not looking down. So what does that mean?
Well, I'm sort of
he's not
assuming that
really-
he is, but it's hard to, this might be indeterminate too, right? I would only want to say that he's doing something we could call critical thinking if he's actively engaging something. So if he's looking down, then I think he must be reflecting on the significance of this circle turning around him. If we see him as it's very hard to see, right? If he's facing the other direction, then he may be thinking about the landscape, about nature, maybe turning his back on the event, which would be very different. It might also be a kind of reflection. I feel like the reflectiveness, in other words, the relative emotional detachment is sort of is represented visually by his vertical isolation, right? He's high up above things. I mean, we use these metaphors in most languages, right? When you talk about vantage point from above, seeing the big picture, seeing from above tends to mean detachment. So that's what I'm thinking. But whether he's interpreting Christ's significance or something else, it's not clear, right? Is that why you asked the question?
No, well, I was just thinking, if you refuse to engage in critical thinking, would that be a meta-critical thinking? Is that an act of critical thinking as well?
Could be. There's also, it's an interesting point because there's also a kind of refusal below. This figure, which is right on axis, right, is the lowest figure in the picture and does not seem to be looking at anything. And there are all sorts of interpretations of how to, read this pair. But for me, this is a kind of refusal. And this maybe, ironically, could be as well. But then it's a question of, is this a response? He seems to be just sort of in his own world. Is this a response, or is this critical thinking, or is it a refusal of critical thinking? I mean, you can consciously choose to ignore the event because you might decide through reflective thought that what you're carrying in your bag, he's a peddler or something, is more important than the execution. Like it might be a choice, I don't know. To focus on very mundane things in the world rather than the drama.
All right, and I don't know who was the first, but you don't have a question. Oh, all right, so Yuri, please.
Okay, it's working. When you were speaking about critical thinking, you were demonstrating some images where people evidently show their emotional response. So I'm a bit following up your discussion. So how do you relate emotional response to critical thinking itself? So what is it?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because for me that's the key point. And it might be what we discuss in the next 2 days. How do we want to define critical thinking? I personally would want to define it as an alternative. In other words, I would not want to call that emotional response critical thinking. I would want to call it a crucial aspect of interpretation. A crucial aspect of education also, if we're talking about that is not critical thinking, but that accompanies it. In other words, that's the sense of the pairing of this reflective figures and emotional figures is that you can't really separate these. But I think it would be important to think about, for me, it's important to think about what the educational program is beyond critical thinking, but not in denial of critical thinking, but that there may be an emotional or intuitive component that we can't call critical thinking, but that's nevertheless embedded in whatever it is that we do that does involve critical thinking.
My presentation.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah. Who wants to be the next?
Okay, now. So I'm going to take a very different disciplinary perspective. One of my professional identities is that of a psychologist. And for a psychologist, the term thinking is not that problematic because it refers to everything, all the cognitive processes that happen in our brains. So not exclusively critical thinking, but very much automatic thinking. And I want to give a plaidoyer on the importance of teaching students about these processes that are happening in the mind. Because we have never known that as much as we know now about what it is. We know that we have at least two functionally different systems of the mind. One, system 1, which is very automatic, associative, effortless, and a system 2, which takes effort, which is analytical, and which is very limited in capacity. And some of you may have read a relatively popular book that has been on the best-selling lists the last couple of years by a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, on Thinking Fast and Slow, where he discusses these two systems. So we have never known as much as we do today also about the processes that influence the way we think and that influence our attitudes and opinions as people. And this knowledge has also never been more accessible than today. So whereas in the mid-20th century, there were some psychologists working on that, now it's very widespread in marketing, and increasingly also governments are employing these principles to form opinions and attitudes of their populations, and influencing elections and other areas. Because the third aspect which has changed is that the ways and possibilities of using and employing these principles via social media have never been more scalable. And we are now able to target individuals on social media with messages which are explicitly tailored to them to reach a certain attitude change. And all of these messages rely on the the functions of the system 1, the automatic one. So I believe that we need to know and understand the heuristics and biases that make up our thinking and that skew our thinking, and to train students in recognizing them and also possibly employing them in their professional lives. So just since the minority here will be psychologists, just to give you a brief overview of 3 of these processes to illustrate it. So for example, there's the availability heuristic. We believe that things that we are able to recall quicker are more true. And obviously that is, so if something comes to mind quickly, we believe that to be true. And as it's not difficult to imagine, that can be exploited very easily through pushing certain messages on and images on media. And that skews our objective thinking. Second second heuristic that plays a big role is the effect heuristic. What feels good feels true. And what doesn't feel good doesn't feel true. And if that is true, and it's also true that it's relatively easy to influence our emotions and how we feel through music, through associations, through images, through associative learning. That is, of course, an avenue for influence, which is very, very powerful and can be exploited. And the third and last one is the confirmation bias. We tend to believe messages that we already agree with. And we tend to disbelieve messages, even if they are argued rationally, that we don't agree with. Now, if you take these 3 heuristics together, availability, emotions, and this confirmation bias, and you couple that with the mechanism of social proof, we believe things to be true that other people that are relevant or similar to us believe to be true. It's not difficult to imagine how indoctrination can work in a closed system, especially in one where you have such strong control over the media as, for example, social media has the potential to establish. So in concluding, I think that as universities we have a responsibility of preparing and of informing and training students on the ways the mind works, to be able to be critical thinkers, because as long as we are not aware of these processes, we are influenced by them, and unfortunately we are even influenced by them if we are aware. But at least we know we were able then to recognize the patterns, and we're able to activate the system 2. And yes, to a degree inoculate ourselves or be aware of what's happening. And I believe that's a very important aspect, so I'm happy that Denise suggested the topic of psychological, the psychological dimension, and I thought I'd make a little contribution to that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. You have a question? Yeah, Tom.
Thank you, Lucas. I would like to ask you whether you would consider adding one more factor to the three you've mentioned, a psychological factor in learning that I have noticed as very prominent, especially as I've made my move from the US system here to Russia. And I would call it, I don't have one word for it right now, but essentially my impression is that a lot of students approach knowledge they receive in a school-like environment as something that yes, it is something that they will know, but sometime before, someone in those institutions has come up with this idea that they will have to do it. This is the way our society works. You go through this process where this knowledge is kind of being forced into your head with a hammer. And so all of them kind of have this, most of them are in this psychological state of doing compulsory work, okay? So if we tell them, please, make a 7-minute presentation about a topic you found most interesting, and they have all this freedom of choice about what they want to talk about out of 12 courses, they will still think this is something I have to do for school. I have to do it, so what do I do? First thing I care about is not making mistakes and making sure I satisfy the authority, right? So I'm curious what are your ideas about how we could change their mindset, this compulsory work mindset?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm observing similar phenomena, and it's very much culturally trained, I believe, because it reflects a lot of patterns of behavior are context dependent, because the same students in a different context may act in a different way potentially, but the context, formal education probably triggers that behavior because that is the way formal education works, and that's how they've been trained to behave and to be successful in formal education. So I believe firstly it's very difficult. But in order to do that, you need to actually model the new type of behavior. We are not able to activate new patterns of behavior if we don't have them developed. So maybe 2 ideas, and probably there are more. Maybe there are other areas of their lives where they are thinking critically. So maybe you can activate these other areas of their lives and transfer that pattern to the classroom. If not, begin small and try to model that behavior. So, yeah, there were two ideas, and it's very context dependent.
Okay.
Yeah, may have more ideas.
Right. We have a question from Maxim also. Oh, okay, but let's have Maxim and then you, right?
Thanks for mentioning these 2 systems. That's a really interesting point for me. This issue has been debated for quite a lot of time right now. There are a bunch of theories, system 1, system 2, heuristic systematic approach. And thinking about critical thinking, we typically oppose the system and say, to think critically means to think in terms of this system 2, right? But that's like, even Kahneman acknowledges that system 1 exists for a reason. So people are kind of cognitive measures, cognitive managers, and we just won't be able to force them to think outside of system 1 just because of psychological limitations. Probably there is a way to make this system 1 a part of critical thinking. We just can't get rid of these biases and heuristics and stereotypes and shortcuts. Can we actually make them a part of critical thinking machine instead of opposing the system to system 2 as form critical thinking?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's impossible to oppose System 1 because most of what we're doing is actually automated. So the question, but we can also learn new automated behaviors. We just need to recognize the cues of when to use what pattern also of thinking.
Yeah, and in this sense, in a way, this automated critical thinking is not like critical thinking. It should be an automated pattern or behavior.
Yes, the critical thinking part, maybe the ability to reflect on it and choose which pattern of behavior to apply and where you need to adapt it.
All right, so we have a question over there. Right, yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Ivanova Ksenia, Institute of State and Law. And why I pose this question is because the thinking and critical thinking also has become the crucial point of my current research. So I'm now really interested in, may I pose this question to you, which is the way for a citizen or for a person to behave in some social call, like the former speaker has shown us. For example, the call of some social crucial thing, which is the best way to behave, to distance yourself from this call and to analyze it distantly, or to be involved in this call, discuss everything with other people, and to have some emotional connection with it.
I'm not sure whether I understand your question.
For example, we have some social call like camera. Sorry.
Social goal?
Yeah. Social situation.
Yeah, okay.
And social aim, social tool. Which is the way to form for a person the critical thinking, to be involved in this situation personally and to discuss this with other people, for example, on the internet, or to distance himself from it and just read other opinions and think. Which is the best way to behave?
I think that's a very broad question that probably can only be answered in a very, very broad meaning. I mean, there's so many different aspects to critical thinking that need to be trained. But so I don't think I'm able to answer your question.
Oh, all right, Isaac, do you still have your question? It will be the last one. Yeah.
What do you think? In fact, thanks for reminding us about System 1 and System 2. It's interesting that the critical thinking discussions appeared before this Kahneman's and Tversky's concept became very popular. So maybe indeed we have to rethink what we're thinking about critical thinking. And don't you think that this distinction between System 1 and System 2 are becoming even more important in the age when we not just have to build our own arguments, but to assess fake news and biases, etc., etc.
I absolutely agree with you. I think it becomes even more important, especially because advertisement and political campaigns are actively exploiting all of these things, tailored to the individual. So we know from the US election that there were tailor-made messages on Facebook to a specific layer of the black population in a specific neighborhood that touched issues in a very emotional way that were relevant to that population, that discouraged people from voting, for example, exploiting a number of these heuristics. So yes, it's very important to know them, to recognize them, and to reflect whether your reaction is automated or whether it's actually an argument is valid, and these are crucial components of being able to think critically.
Yes, Andrei.
Lucas, thank you for your intervention of this psychological or even physiological approach in thinking. Do you believe that how education organized for everyday routine, I mean time schedule, breaks, group composition, prevent or organized in this way that critical thinking is not possible to this kind of form of routine, everyday educational organization?
Actually, don't think so, because to learn a new behavior, and behavior is context dependent, you need to establish a certain context in which that behavior is adequate. So you need a certain space over time to develop these new patterns of behavior, and if everything is completely arbitrary, people will just use the patterns of behavior that they already know and have automated. So actually believe that you need to have a certain format of time and space to learn something new.
So do you mean that critical thinking can only emerge in the context of institutional violence?
That's my
very
delicate
polemic.
hint. That's my delicate hint.
No, but it needs continuity in terms of relationships, time and space to develop something new. And relationships, by the way, I haven't mentioned yet, are very important as well. We need models from whom we can learn, and that can happen in a Greek courtyard just as well as in an institution, and just as well it can't happen depending on what we do with the students.
All right, I think Denis was going to speak next, right? Because this is his area. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas, for your mention of Daniel Kahneman's book. And I just want to say that you know, it can be dangerous to associate, and I heard some you know, some ideas of this, to associate you know, thinking with system 1 and critical thinking with system 2, especially you know, when we note the fact that Kahneman's theory was developed before, you know, theory of default mode network and other things in psychology. So I start from just short note that some parts of system 1 could be critically involved in critical thinking, and some parts of you know, system 2 could be you know, unuseful there. So I will start from just simple analogy. As many of you, as many of people in this room, I drive a car. It means that I need to park this car at least twice a day. It's in some place it's not very hard. It's easy task. For example, I think in Red Hook or on the campus of the Bard College it's quite easy. I have no idea about Almaty or even Tyumen, but I know that in Moscow or in St. Petersburg it's quite complicated. Yeah. So you have no need to think critically about this. So let's compare two situations. The first situation is you know, parking a car, parking in quotes, marks on the training ground. That's you know, the situation that every one who you know, who passed the exam in the police to the driving license went through. So what you need? You have a space designated by some landmarks, and you have to park your car into that space. What do you need for that? What you know, skills? What habits you need for that? You need to evaluate, you know, distances, angles, you know, sizes, etc. You need to know how to operate with you know, your car, you know, with your car and devices that you know, you have to use. You have to know the basic principles of, you know, parallel parking. Yes. So what difference you can feel in the real situation when you park your car in a busy city area in a traffic hour? So you need all those, you know, skills that I mentioned, but also you need you have to use your theory of mind, because there is many drivers who want to park their car in the same space maybe, and you have to predict how they will behave. The second, you need to evaluate your own skills to decide if you can park your car here, or maybe you need to drive away fast as you can. So also you need some, you have to use some memory about the past situations and your experience. You have to use ethics, because sometimes I understand that I can park my car here, it will be good, but I will block Andrew's car. But I know that Andrew will be at work until midnight, so it's okay. Or I can see the beautiful parking place, but designed for handicapped persons. Can I park there for 15 minutes? Is it ethical? So I have to use ethics. I have to evaluate probability of the result, and I have to realize that there is no answer, because on the parking ground, it works like pass-fail. I park on this designated space, or I break some landmarks, so I fail my exam. In the real life, this is some kind of continuum. I can park, I can almost park, I can park in the second row. It's not very ethically, but sometimes it's practically. I can fail. I can drive away and then call Uber, because you have no need to park your Uber car as driver to do it for you. So, and now when we return to definition of cognitive, that cognitive science gives to critical thinking, it's, there are at least, I found at least 15 different definitions in cognitive science publications. But I will use the simplest one by Diane Halpern, the author of the book, The Psychology of Critical Thinking. And she defined the critical thinking as using cognitive techniques that, or strategy that increase probability of desired outcome. So it's easy. But important thing that this is about probability. So there's no warranty that we will reach desired outcome. The outcome is desired, not exist. So we cannot be sure that there is some right answer or right outcome. And I told them about the probability. What it means for education? It means that we cannot design a particular class or course called critical thinking. And I know a few examples when people introduce the class in critical thinking and then realize that it didn't work, and then decided that this is because this particular professor failed his goal. So we need to hire another beautiful person who can teach class on critical thinking. But the problem is that there's no such thing as a class in critical thinking. In the same way that there is no such class that can teach you to park a car in the busy city area in rush hour. Someone can teach you how to park a car, or you can do it by yourself. It's easy. But for thinking critically, you need some framework. And in these terms, the framework is very important. How the curriculum is designed, how the space is organized for critical thinking. Because when I used to work at Helsinki University, at Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies, and I share my office with one Finnish sociologist, and she worked on a problem. It's a big problem. I laugh at the first moment when I heard about it, but then I realized that it is a big problem. How to develop critical thinking skills, how the teacher have to move across the class area when she teaches to promote the better outcomes. So it's it was my first reaction, Dara, yes, actually to laugh. But then it's very serious. So I don't know what critical thinking is, so, and the cognitive science still, trying to define it. But I know that any solution in this, in promoting critical thinking in academia, can be only complex. So there is no particular class that can do that. Yes, it's very important to do it on the early stage. So I absolutely and completely agree with Andrew that we need to use the first year for that, but not only first year. So critical thinking has to be the part of every class at the university, but not, by direct way. So it's my idea. I think that we will have a chance to discuss it in small groups, and thank you.
I want to ask the first question, because I'm not sure I quite understood you. So you imply that everybody who can park a car in a busy city has a critical thinking skills?
No. I've just used analogy because it's the way we think, how Turner and Fauconnier define it, presumes that we use analogies for different abstract situations and ideas, like, for example, critical thinking. My idea was not that parking a car in a busy city is like, you need a critical thinking for that. But when you park a car in a busy area, you have to use some things that were important for critical thinking. So theory of mind, metacognition, evaluation of probabilities, past experience, and some other
And that's
things.
what every driver does when they park.
But, yes,
right?
but
Okay.
the answer is that some drivers use, when they park in system 1, because they do it automatically, but they just have these skills installed in the system 1. Some drivers, the new drivers, unexperienced drivers, they use system 2 or maybe even system 3 that Kahneman doesn't mention. So it's the same thing with people, and when.
Okay, all right. So just
So
to make it shorter. So the approach that you apply here does not really have the hierarchy of thinkings, so to speak, right? It's one and the same cognitive instruments. There are a lot of them. They're complicated and they interrelate in a very interesting way with each other. But there is no real difference between somebody interpreting Bruegel's picture and somebody's parking a car, because it's pretty much the same number of cognitive skills employed, maybe just in different proportions, things like that.
There is a difference, because for critical thinking, it's very important that the result, that the solution of the problem, it's important to you, because when I try to analyze the Bruegel picture or a poem, it's interesting and it's important for me, but I can postpone it. I can do it tomorrow or after tomorrow. When I need to park my car, I need to park my car now. I need to use it to survive.
Yeah, but if you have an exam on Bruegel's interpretation, you also have to do it right now in order to survive.
It depends from the quality. It depends from design of exam. If the question is, so we with Andrew we failed because we presumed that the question will be, who on this picture think critically, and we decided the bird, but it was a guy, on the top, so we failed. But if the question would be, why we have this picture here on the conference about critical thinking, it's more interesting. Thank you so much.
Who has a question? Dara? Oh, all right. Max.
Thank you. I'll start from afar. Somebody mentioned fake news here and post-truth theories.
Not me.
Right? Not you, right? But still, that's related to the topic of critical thinking. And this has been hype, and it has been discussed for many years now. And but for the recent probably year or a couple of months, a lot of research papers have been published on this topic. And basically, scholars show that fake news is a kind of fake news itself. So because there's a paper which was published a couple of months ago showing that in 2016 in America, about 0.8% of news consumed by Clinton supporters were fake out of all other political news about Clinton and Trump, and about 1.4 or 2% of news consumed by Trump supporters were fake. So the amount of this news just insignificant to have any impact on people. And which leads me to a conclusion that the whole debate about fake news is a kind of fake news itself. And I try to understand this debate about critical thinking. Why we keep thinking about critical thinking? Isn't it like, isn't the idea about importance of critical thinking it's similar to fake news story?
He asked me to do that.
It's not, this question not to you personally, but I guess to all the panelists. We discussed Kahneman. I don't quite understand why we focus on the system 2 and system 1, because he was criticized very much, and the argument was that his methodology is wrong and experiments are, wrong. And he publicly acknowledged that this experimental data in this book is insufficient to prove his theory. For instance, there was this debate a couple of years ago.
But it was successful. Good sales,
yeah,
good money.
Exactly, that's the problem.
And for writing this, he used critical thinking to evaluate. And you can see if you know other books by Kahneman, you can compare it with his other books about attention and see the huge difference, because he did it just for the broad audience who read fake news and sometimes fake, books about psychology.
I mean,
Maximo, I think I have an answer to your question, right? I mean, it may be that the conclusion of our discussion is that there is no critical thinking per se. There are all kinds of cognitive skills we should be developing. I think this is pretty much moving in that direction. We should learn people how to park a car and to interpret Braille. These are all cognitive skills we should develop. There is no this kind of critical thinking as opposed to non-critical thinking. And then we will simply stop advertising liberal arts education as a way to develop critical thinking. That's a possible conclusion of the discussion. So we are open to this possibility.
Probably. I don't know.
I would like to say something about this debate from the, let's say, the perspective of the comparison between natural science and social and human sciences. So I have a background in both fields, physics and philosophy. And actually the difference in what could be critical thinking in these different disciplines is really interesting. If you look at natural science, typically the critical thinking comes after 5 years or 4 years of very painstaking and long learning of, well, mastering of what is called knowledge. What is the essential ingredient of knowledge? That's theories. So critical thinking, which is here, I use it in the sense of creative thinking, comes really pretty late in the whole process. Now I would like to make a plaidoyer for the idea that actually in human and social sciences, the difference should not be that big with natural science. In other words, one often hears that humanities and social sciences are in crisis. Why? Well, here is a conjecture. Maybe we have given up too easily in believing that we should teach solid knowledge and theories. We have stopped, I have the impression, believing in the value of theories too easily. We hear often expressions like, well, there are no right answers, but maybe there are answers which are better than others, right? Because they're based on more solid theories, more solid facts, and so on. So, yeah, I would phrase it in the following way. To me, there is no useful critical thinking without mastering solid knowledge, solid theories, and solid facts. And then critical thinking comes more or less automatically, because critical thinking is then creative thinking, and everyone who knows his fields well, he wants to do in the end only one thing, which is creative thinking, which is, you know, adding to the knowledge or criticizing his masters. The famous physicist Feynman said, doing research is not believing what the experts say. But before being able to do that, one needs to know the expert knowledge.
All right, so I think we take that as a comment, because I don't think it's a question to particular...
Completely agree.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, thank you, Louis. So I think these topics will definitely emerge many times during our discussions. So there is a next person. So you were suggesting that you want to do it.
If I could.
Yeah, sure.
If I could.
Yeah.
So. I'm chomping at the bit, guys. I'm like really, like, probably none of you probably know me except outside of SAS. My name is David Dussault.
Can you use the microphone, please?
My name is David Dussault. It's here. Talk about institutional violence. I'm going to use water polo as an example of ways of, let's say, I was going to draw parallels and all these types of things between what we've learned coaching water polo teams. We developed, actually built a team from scratch starting in 2006. And I left for a couple of years. But at the end of the time, before I moved to SAS, let's say all 5 of our teams went from losing horribly, and within the span of 5 years, we medaled in every single group this year. So there are a lot of parallels that I could get into and talk about the details and everything of how we did it and who the people are behind it, but I'm not going to get into that right now. What I want to ask as a rhetorical question is, what happens when we fail? We're putting in a lot of, let's say, ideas and a lot of, let's say, energy in terms of how do we define terms? What's the context under which critical thinking should happen? But at the end of the day, what happens when it fails? What happens when liberal arts education, our students, don't get the ideas? What happens when our players don't win the gold medal? I was just watching, this is no disrespect for you to Denise, but I was watching a clip from the European finals that was last week, and I'm looking at these guys from Olympiacos, one of the big Greek teams versus the Italian team, and these guys are all technically fantastic. They come up, they're in fantastic shape, they're able to do the passing properly, they look and see their players, they have all the eyes, and all of a sudden, these guys lose. So why compete in sports? Why train yourself so hard that you lose friends, you can't eat what you want, your parents die or your relatives die around you and you can't be there to actually, you can't participate in the social like you once did. Why dedicate yourself to something that's so demanding? And the reason I got into this, and I checked it with a friend of mine, this is Pantelis Liumis, he was a national, actually men's team, Greece, national, just on the Olympic level. He's a cognitive neuroscientist, electric engineer by training. I sent this to him because this is something that I've never done before, to make a presentation on this. So he was looking at it, he says, yeah, this makes a lot of sense for us from the engineering perspective. Go ahead and do it. I don't think the audience is going to kill you. So you could see when we succeed, it's all wonderful. This is the men's team. And I like to think of myself as a product of liberal arts education. I went to Norwich University, military school in Vermont, liberal arts, language, international relations, let's say history studies, and I ended up going to Alexandria Institute, PhD, Russian domestic politics, political science. I was picked up, I moved into the energy sector, was there for 5 years with the gas company, and then I resigned. I became a water polo coach. And some people will ask why. I still don't know. But in any case, I did it. And I've enjoyed it a lot. And I think there's a lot of things that we can learn. And I guess I did something right, because Andre and the crew here were nice enough to actually hire me on. I start in August. So this is one of the reasons why I do it. This is the mecca of water polo for me. This is in Herceg-Novi, in Jadran, in Chornogoria, in Montenegro. And this is one of the things why I get into it. It's the competitive spirits, all these types of things. I don't want to get into this too much. There are parallels here, but I think the major thing is this, that we aim to foster individuals' cognitive ability to perceive, comprehend, and ultimately deliver under stressful conditions. This is what we're aiming in our players. This is what we want from our students. But when I say this, hey, there's a saying in English which is fantastic, especially with my players. I work with guys that were 13, 14 years old, and we keep repeating, pounding into their heads again and again and again. Guys, you have to do this to get better because the players are going to get bigger, the topics are going to get more difficult. You're going to say this all the time. But you can take a horse to water, you can't make it drink. You can't do it. So what then? What happens when these guys don't deliver? What happens when their playing career ends? What happens when, Andrew, your son goes out of college and hits the job market, if he hits the job market? Where's the added value? And I think here, I'll end my presentation, we're looking at developing personalities. Individuals, people that can recognize the skills at some point in time. Maybe they recognize it after their playing career. Maybe like me, who went from BA in international studies, worked for a bit, was in the court system, and then said, I want to learn Russian language. That's where my passion is. Then I dropped Russian language. I moved to Helsinki and started political science and international relations. Then I dropped that and went to do something else. Something stays with us after liberal arts. And that's what I think I'd like to be thinking about over the week, or the weekend, actually. Well, thank you for your time, and I really appreciate it.
Anyone wants to say something to that, or we move to the... Yeah, please.
I have a quick comment, which is maybe also a question about what you mean by personality. What you're describing at the end reminds me of the description of education in Book 7 of Plato's Republic, with the notion that it's about turning the whole soul towards the good, right? But the idea being that the intellectual activity is somehow the whole person. You mean something like that by personality?
It could be, because when you mentioned Plato, the coaches that we had in the beginning were Greeks. So I think, which is true. So I mean, I think they kind of snuck that in on us. It could be this way, because I think we're all dealing with generalities here. That we all want to actually come away with something that's tangible that we can apply, and we can see something developed institutionally or personally. But I don't think there are terms that you can fully, put down. It's, like Coach Belichick in New England says with the New England Patriots, it is what it is at some point. You can put your finger on it, but you can't quantify it. So I think it's a balance of substance and form, in terms of when I talk about personality. Of course, intellect is part of it, but there's also this emotional, let's say, component that you were speaking of before.
All right, thank you very much. So I think Jonathan is going to be the next one.
So rather than a coherent presentation, I have 9 thoughts I've written down on critical thinking. I want to begin by saying, though, that the all-American game of baseball, right? I don't know if you've ever seen, it's like Lapta, I guess, or whatever, that if you fail 7 in 10 times hitting, you are incredibly successful, right? So if you are a 300 hitter, you are considered a brilliant player. So we can get used to failure, and that's okay. I also feel slightly contradictory here, because here we are talking about critical thinking, and I want to defend critical thinking. Bard College's slogan is a place to think. I was thinking about that, not to critically think, so I'm going to have to see after the weekend whether I should advocate for it to be a place to critically think, or like Andre would want, to be called a place to think. But I'm very honored to be here. So here are my 9 thoughts. Thought number 1, on rote learning, okay? And we heard from Professor Fruman and others about the predominance of rote learning, and I think it's a mistake for us to assume that rote learning isn't as common as it is. We work not simply, Bard College, not simply in the United States, but here in Russia, in Kyrgyzstan, in the Middle East. And if we're thinking about critical thinking, what are we juxtaposing it against? And one of the things is rote learning, which is clearly the enemy both of creative thinking, right, and of critical thinking. And the commonality with which rote learning is associated with educational processes is very great. When we've heard about blowing up or committing violence on the educational system, I think one of the things when I'm thinking about what is critical in critical thinking, that is challenging professors, right? And professors, more importantly, being willing to be challenged, okay? So originating from the Socratic method and then moving into educational processes, which I'll talk about later, but having a system in which not only are we teaching students, but we as the professoriate, right, are willing to go in and be challenged by our students and encourage being challenged by our students is a very important element of that, and that might be part of what the critical in critical thinking is. The second point I want to raise is about contemplation, and I think Andrew and Jeff already spoke about that, but things like reflection, receptivity, as we heard about before, but also ambiguity, looking at assumptions, using metaphor, as we heard from Denise, and the capacity to actually sit down and read and think is part of this critical thinking process, especially today. And as we're thinking about what we are trying, the structures we are trying to create for students to try to encourage environments in which contemplation is possible and encouraged. A third point is listening, and I think, again, Jeff made this point, but listening to others is an essential part of critical thinking, right? And having empathy for other people's ideas and being able to consider them carefully is an essential part of critical thinking, I believe, as opposed to simply thinking, right? You could think whatever you want and not listen to anyone else, right? Critical thinking may involve, it exists in an environment in which you are actually listening actively both to perhaps the teacher, to fellow students, to other people about things. So that is, in a way, this iterative process of learning is partly at the root of what critical thinking is, as opposed to simply thinking. 4, posing questions. There is nothing more important in an educational process than learning how to pose questions, right? And that might be about a paper, that might be about a scientific research project, that might be about the basis of analyzing a reading. And I think that, again, there is nothing more important. One could think about various things, but an essential part of a critical thinking process is learning how to pose questions, the answers to which might not be intuitively obvious. I always require my students to pose questions, and I always tell them that if the answer I could find out in 10 seconds on my iPhone, then that isn't the question that I want you to be posing, all right? And again, that is part of what we are thinking about as we're adapting notions of critical thinking to the present day. Then the next point, point 5, is discerning information. Discerning information. I think that came up again. Right now we have a different problem. When I was in college, the problem was finding information, right? And when I was in high school, I was on a debate team. I believe in debate. I'm a firm believer in debate. And I spent hours and hours in a university library, where Andrew was, Northwestern University, trying to find out information that wasn't readily available. Now the problem in terms of critical thinking is discerning which information is more valuable. So you could be an analytic thinker and be reading an article which is totally, the fakeness and fake news I don't quite buy, even if it is 0.6%, because a very important thing which is fake, let's say information on Iraq's nuclear weapons before the whole world is changed by the United States invasion of Iraq, that fake news, which was perpetrated by the government, right, is fairly important. So whatever information I am reading, right, to be discerning about what that is and analyzing something which is discerning and knowing multiple sources of information from which I could get information to analyze. Now here I looked up quickly, cheating of course, the American Association of Colleges and Universities definition of critical thinking. So I will read that to you. That's the leading organization of liberal arts thinking. And I don't necessarily agree with all of this, but I might as well put up some definition since I don't think we've had one yet. Have we? Has anyone actually concretely define it? I don't, sort of. All right, here's the definition. Critical thinking is a habit of mind characterized by the comprehensive exploration of issues, ideas, artifacts, and events before accepting or formulating an opinion or a conclusion. So I'll say this again. Critical thinking is a habit of mind. I like the habit of mind part. Characterized by the comprehensive exploration of issues, ideas, artifacts, and events before accepting or formulating an opinion or a conclusion. All right, thought number 6. liberal arts and sciences. Okay, so in the description we hear liberal arts education. I think it's all, we've heard a lot on the sciences, some of which I think is wrong. Liberal arts education should include sciences. The notion that there is something radically different about science education from humanities education, I don't necessarily agree with. I think there are differences and knowledge is not unimportant. Andrew was talking about Tim Stearns, who's the head of biology at Stanford, who has created a course for first-year students precisely to get them to pose questions and get active in the labs on questions they are posing during their first year of studies. Bard President Leon Botstein's brother, David Botstein, was inherently involved with Princeton University in redesigning their science curriculum. So you're not doing the sequence of biology 101, chemistry 101, what have you, that you are integrating sciences and getting students to pose questions which they are dealing with in the classroom from year one. Olin School of Engineering, the same thing with engineering. So I believe that there are differences in terms of knowledge bases as one advances, but I am not convinced that some of the same issues that go into posing questions, right, doing research and getting involved in the sciences is necessarily radically different from the humanities. Point 7, critical thinking does not equal cynicism. Just a point here, and I think it's worth pointing out. It's very easy as a teacher to be such a critical thinker that all you are doing is imbuing your students with cynicism. And I think that we as teachers have an obligation to also point out agency for our students in the world around them. So rather, especially I teach politics, I could get straight 5 teaching evaluations by trashing Donald Trump every minute in my class. That's what Bard College is like, right? That is not what I'm interested in, and I don't think that's our obligation. Our obligation is to also teach students about empowerment and agency and what they, for example, as citizens can do. Point 8 is about process. And I think as we're talking about critical thinking, if we're including things like challenging professors, listening to others, empowering students about the power of ideas, we want to think about the academic structure and what fosters that. And Andrew spoke about the first year, and Denise did as well. And I think things like, okay, you could be a good analytic thinker, but if you're not required to read texts, right, or deep texts, then you might not develop those types of skills, right? You might be required to be, you might learn analytic thinking skills, but if you're not required to experience the iterative thought between writing and thought, which is what the writing, language and thinking program, which is being adapted here, and which Smolny in St. Petersburg and outside uses, then you may not benefit sufficiently, or you may not have the opportunity to develop those critical thinking, contemplative, question-posing skills, and might not be empowered from the very start to begin posing questions of your professor and breaking down this barrier of the professor transmitting knowledge to the student. So process, things like, I love things like debate, and I love in the classroom, and I love things like role-playing, in particular, simulations which require people to develop empathy for other positions, because that helps in this process of what we might call thinking, or what I actually think is legitimately called critical thinking. And then just as a final point, adaptability, I just wanted to say, you know, the studies consistently show that graduates of liberal arts institutions actually do well over long periods of time in the employment market. So something is going right, okay, within that. And I just have a funny story. The president of Bard, Leon Botstein, so he is, I think, in his 42nd year, talking about stability of cadres, right, in the US, you know, as president of Bard, and it's his second presidency. And one of the things I was thinking of when this is, what he did to become a college president in his first presidency was not demonstrate that he knows everything, but convince people. It's a very funny story. He was in New York City. There was a flu epidemic, and they needed a big report for the education department. The mayor called for that. And what he was able to do is not know everything about educational reform in New York City, but he was able to convince people that he did know something about it, right? Skills, verbal skills, writing skills, and then be smart enough to know who to talk to learn about what you need to do to make the argument in the paper to demonstrate that. So hopefully we're at least convincing our students, or teaching our students, to be articulate advocates for themselves, and to teach them how, when they don't know when they know what they don't know, that they could find the means of getting the information to know what they need to know. And I think liberal arts and sciences education with critical thinking, when done effectively, does that. Thank you.
Thank you. I suggest we actually skip the question part because we have so many people who haven't spoken yet, right? Because we'll have a lot of space for discussion later in the day today, right? If you don't mind, Jonathan, unless somebody has this very urgent. You want to speak next, right? Okay, please, John.
My experience with the rhetoric of critical thinking mainly comes from my education in America during between 2003 and 2009, but also to an extent from Singapore and Ireland. And I did a PhD in Renaissance literature at Duke University. And as everybody knows, the Renaissance was a period in which new intellectual horizons were opened and people began to study new types of object, and they expanded their geographical horizons, and intellectuals who weren't necessarily connected with universities became important. And it was a reaction to a state of sclerosis in the late medieval university that we sometimes refer to as scholasticism. And one of the things that characterizes scholasticism is the combination of hyper-specialization and intense ideological uniformity. And the hyper-specialization conceals the ideological uniformity, because academics are still arguing with each other and writing papers and disagreeing about things, and in a very intense way. But they're doing so within quite a narrow paradigm. And I think that at the moment we are in a new era of scholasticism in the university world internationally, because we do have this hyper-specialization, but we also are doing it within quite a narrow ideological paradigm that is loosely describable as liberal. And in this context, I would draw attention to the fact that in America, we're at the end of a 50-year trend during which conservative and right-wing intellectuals have largely been purged from the academy. If you looked at the makeup of the faculty in a typical American university in the 1960s, you would see that Democrats outnumbered Republicans by about 2 to 1, and today it's more like 20 to 1. And in many departments like English or anthropology, you'll almost never find a conservative intellectual. And the consequence of this for critical thinking has been that, as Jonathan Haidt of NYU showed recently, that liberal and leftist students have a much poorer understanding of conservative and right-wing political positions than conservative students do of liberal positions. And this is because liberal students operate in an echo chamber. They never have to defend themselves intellectually, whereas conservative students who dare to put their heads above the parapet are constantly having to defend themselves. And they come out of college smarter for that reason. And one of the things that we've seen in universities, both in Britain and America over the past few decades, or over the past 2 decades at least, is an epidemic of things like safe spaces, bias hotlines, no platforming of heretical speakers, by perhaps a small number of activists on campus, but nevertheless, a group of activists who are very influential. And this kind of behavior is also observable all the time on social media. And it's the behavior of people who can't defend themselves intellectually, who have to resort to this kind of hysterical behavior. And I think this is a direct consequence of the homogenization, the ideological homogenization of universities. So I would say that what we have to do, if we want to really promote critical thinking in universities, is take the focus off things like gender and ethnic and racial diversity, because we've done a lot of work to promote those things. And I'm not saying that we should, stop being concerned with them altogether, but we need to start promoting intellectual diversity and looking at conservative and right-wing and other kinds of thinkers that tend to get smeared as far right or right-wing or conservative simply because they're not reading from the liberal script. And in that way we can, perhaps create something analogous to the 16th century Renaissance, in which, new types of critical thinking emerged.
Yeah, maybe we'll make an exception for John because you were pretty brief. Maybe somebody has a question to ask to this or comment. All right, yeah, please.
Can you come up with one example of an intellectual who is smeared, in your opinion, in Western academia? Just one example.
I can come up with numerous examples.
One, yeah,
I could point to Jordan Peterson at the moment, who's one of the most visible public intellectuals in the world today. I could point to the way that Francis Fukuyama is typically dealt with in English departments and other humanities departments. I know he's within the academy, but he's generally used as just a foil for leftist political polemics by people who haven't read him. I could point to somebody who's even more radically heretical, like the blogger Mekius Moldbug, who describes himself as a neo-reactionary and is one of the intellectual kind of supports for Trumpism. I could point to the people at Claremont Graduate University who have been vilified in the past 2 years for their support of Trump. I could also point to Roger Scruton, who was forced out of the academy in the 1980s for writing a critique of the New Left. Or you know, I could point to somebody like Michael Rechtenwald, who's in the news at the moment for his criticisms of social justice ideology at NYU. There are dozens and dozens of examples.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Yeah, I think it's an interesting area to explore because Jonathan said something similar but different, right? When he said that, well, I prefer not to just, you know, criticize Trump in the class, although students will like it, but because I think there are more interesting things to do, should be done in the classroom. But if you simply don't do that, there is this kind of silent understanding about everybody is critical of Trump, of course, but we're not going to discuss that because it's so clear, and let's discuss other issues, right? Whereas what John advocates for is that you actually have to discuss Trump, but you have to include somebody who is pro-Trump in the classroom. Yeah. You want to comment on that?
Just to be clear, that's I mean, part of that is actually bringing in. I mean, BART has a partnership with West Point precisely, or partly for that reason, and in our classes, in my classes and other classes, actually I brought in literally Trump supporters to talk to people. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I'm saying that it's easy as a teacher to go with the flow, and I think that's the description, and the challenge of us as teachers is in fact a challenge, is to not do what is easy to be popular.
Okay. Thank you. Who wants to be next? Yes, John. Tom.
Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Bluzewicz, and I'm a professor here at SAS, just like John. And as many of you know, me and John, we share a lot of beliefs about what's wrong in the academia today. So I will just quickly follow up. Because I was listening to all of our presentations before. It struck me that we all focus mostly on epistemological issues, such as what is knowledge, what are some cognitive processes that can be influenced by psychological instruments, what is truth, is there truth, what is the right, wrong answer. Whereas to me as a historian, the most kind of immediate, spontaneous, I would say, intuitive understanding of critical thinking is saying something critical about persons in a position of authority. For a historian, this is kind of the most immediate association. Imagine a classroom, let's say in the Soviet Union or other society considered by people who are right of that mainstream spectrum as not a free society. Critical thinking would be saying something critical towards what is accepted as mainstream truth or ideological truth. So I just wanted to say a few things about what I also think is an interesting phenomenon happening right now. This kind of I think we are seeing some origins of a backlash, I would say, against this kind of homogeneity that has been generated by universities. And one example I can give you is from my own personal experience when I was growing up and I was first learning about politics, international politics, how democracies work. There's this stereotype in Poland I mean, in Europe in general. I'm from Poland originally. That this country east to us, which is not Russia but Belarus, it's frequently coined or described in newspapers as the last dictatorship of Europe. For example, because the president of that country receives usually more than 90% of electoral vote in an election. And this is considered in Europe by most people, most commentators, as something outrageous and a sign of that society being kind of so, even if the election is true, if people don't question the actual validity, I mean the counting process, the legitimacy, then you know the result of the election is considered to be a syndrome of something wrong with that society. I mean, if 90% of people agree about something, that's a sign that something makes them agree, because it's just not. It's not a common phenomenon in nature, I guess, to have 90% of people agreeing with each other. If you take a random sample of people, like you look at the U.S. population and the results of recent, say, 30 elections, the distribution of the vote is nearly always half-half, and give and take a few millions in that direction. I mean, this is more or less what I think a biologist or an evolutionary scientist would call a kind of a natural distribution of opinions, a natural process of polarization. And then if you look at the subscription numbers, or what is it called, number of registered voters in a given county in America, right? There are statistics like that. In some zip code areas, such as the one I'm very familiar with, the Cambridge, Massachusetts area, 02138, I believe. The number of registered voters who openly declared themselves as in favor of a political party called the Democrats is something along 96-97% of the population. And then maybe 2% kind of undeclared, and Republicans are, like John said, I'm not a Republican myself, but just as a historian, to me that's pretty amazing. It's in absolute terms, it's kind of it's worse than Belarus. I apologize. I don't want to offend anyone, but I was struck by our focus on epistemology, and as a historian, I would maybe, if someone's interested, I would also want to go back a little bit to this kind of traditional understanding of what it means to say something critical publicly. I mean, this most kind of immediate. I mean, we talked about criticizing professors, right? And this is just such an outrageous thing to do in the country I come from. It's virtually unthinkable. To criticize a professor, it means you're just looking for a reason to be kicked out of that school. So I would like to go back to that concept and really try to understand how is it possible that we have generated in the academic world so much uniformity and kind of agreement on also on political issues and things that John was talking about. So I guess I'll just stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Who wants to be next? Yes, please.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay. So, my name is Yuri Rudnev. I'm from, no? Okay.
Well, just speak louder. I mean,
okay, I can, because
keep
I have
your
a student
mic closer.
with hearing impairment, so I can do everything like that. Okay, so my name is Yuri Rudnev.
No, with the mic. I mean, you use the mic and you still speak louder.
Okay.
Yeah.
I need to
No.
myself.
Make it as loud as you can. Right?
Like that?
Yeah.
All right. Third time. Okay. My name is Yuri Rudnev. I'm from Central European University, and I'm a PhD student there. And this year, I've worked as an instructor for 2 preparatory programs of Central European University in Budapest for undergraduates from various backgrounds who want to apply for graduate programs in European universities. Respectively, I taught world history for refugees and for the Roma, the pejorative exonymies gypsies. For those courses, a mutually identified goal was to create a perspective of world history where students' identity plays a constitutive role. So, during the forum, I would like to reflect on this experience and elaborate the ways in which a more inclusive, interactive, and critically oriented teaching of historical subjects can be undertaken. Having dealt with critical thinking and critical theory extensively, I believe that, inspired by critical thought, an instructor may go beyond mere critical thinking procedures that any historical inquiry supposes per se, while at the same time avoiding indoctrination. I would call this method teaching ruptures or discontinuities. Let me demonstrate in 3 pictures how I imagine modern academia and teaching history in there. So, that's a classical painting and an archetype of academia itself. One may lecture in monologue form on what's going on there during many classes or even years. And, okay, yeah. This second picture, it's the Lee interpretation made in 1980. He deconstructs Raphael's painting, presenting it as anachronistic. There are many motives that the instructor has to explain in addition to the original setting. The painting speaks in a complex voice that often leaves students confused, so they just remember, oh, it was about some colored rectangles, right? And the third one, an interpretation of the School of Athens made this year for Venice Biennale. Instead of the Greek philosophers, there are 50 models of academic spaces from different universities. Without interacting, this place is initially empty. Instead of a beholder, it presumes an actor. Furthermore, the deconstruction here reaches the most profound level. The space is more dynamic and can host a variety of media to make sense out of it. Additionally, the later school provides quite interesting possibilities to challenge an actor's emotions, knowledge, relations with the subject, as well as the object itself. On the other hand, it is emptied of the meta-narratives that penetrate the first 2 pictures. The last image, perhaps, represents a more pure form of exploration. Following the idea that students' dialogue with an instructor should unfold on some emptied intellectual scene, I would consider the question of the proper language. It's no surprise that while teaching history for minorities, either refugees or the Roma, along with the general notions of critical thinking, some concepts of critical theory are inevitably introduced to deconstruct the various meta-narratives which distort the minor ones. Yet in many cases, critical theory uses a complicated language. Just remember Marta Nussbaum's criticism addressed to Judith Butler in her paper, The Professor of Parody. And for my Roma student who is interested in how subalterns made their music across history, I can hardly assign readings from Adorno, Bourdieu, Butler, or Spivak. I agree that a nearly impenetrable language might articulate their struggle, but hence it's funny to hear from Theodor Adorno, when I made my theoretical model, I couldn't have guessed that people would try to realize it with Molotov cocktails. But what else could he expect? Indeed, if critical thought is written down in obscure, condensed language, it doesn't mean that an instructor must teach it likewise. One may distribute it using various medias at hand, or some more uncommon techniques. Speaking of space and time, one may play with them, creating different impressions of how the history flows, especially as regards its continuity, causality, and scale. Historical imagination traditionally is understood as creating narrative or establishing continuities of the events. Thus, there is a higher risk for students that either critical thinking or critical pedagogy would impose an implicit logic, as both say that one needs to reestablish some truth. But who knows what truth of history is? Furthermore, critical pedagogy and critical thinking leave no room for personal experience and emotions, proclaiming the virtues of impartiality or, contrarily, the struggle against oppression. Therefore, I would propose some techniques for breaking commonly accepted continuities of the events, so students' personality could creep inside through that rupture. Using paintings or photos helps to ask first, how do you feel about it? Were you in the same situation? Before asking what's going on there and why. This effect can be enhanced by montage that alters space and time. It is easy to put together two depictions of the events divided by time and ask, do you feel that they really belong to some continuity? Do they make sense together? In some cases, it's fruitful to challenge narratives going backwards in time from the nowadays images. This parataxis, as it is called in Adorno, might work not only in time but also in space, in history. Besides putting together images from the concurrent cultures, one may combine those belonging to the micro and global history, this way zooming in and out. Thus, one may discover that history is not like a Russian doll, as Bruno Latour notes. Who knows what's inside? This applies not only to the visual data, but also to music, movies, and material objects. Cooling down hot media or making cool media hot is another way of creating ruptures. Furthermore, it can improve students' visual literacy. I think that nearly everybody felt dizzy watching presentations made in Prezi, and yet, I encourage introducing some similar conceptual tools in teaching history. So, to sum up, I have two general questions related to the topic of the forum, to the topics of the forum. The first one is, how can the modern abundance of media help us make sense of the concepts of critical thinking and critical theory? And the second one, can the concept of rupture contribute to teaching in humanities, along with or in contrast to continuity? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So, as I said, we'll have to, I think, postpone the discussion for until later in the day, tomorrow. So, who wants to be the next? Yeah, Zach, please.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Zach Reyna. I work here at SAS. I will keep my comments very, very quick. So I just following up sort of on Tomic's point about something that surprised me so much is that we haven't talked so much about the political task of critical theory. And for me, from my coming from of critical thinking, coming from a political theory, critical thinking is all about politics. It's about questioning authority, one, but it's also it's not just something that's learned in community, but it's also something done in community and practiced in community. So I see though the sort of the genealogy of where things maybe went wrong, perhaps a little bit differently. I think that in my mind there's this one aspect of critical thinking is something that I've been calling sort of like apocalyptic thinking. It's thinking that seeks to unveil or expose. To this is what apocalypse is. It's the unveiling. And this is usually what leftist critical thinkers do in politics. They try to expose power structures and show how where there's I don't know, whether you're a Marxist or whether you're a feminist, you try to show where there's power relations that we didn't realize before. I think that's one aspect of critical thinking, and I think it's a necessary aspect, and I think it's important. But I think that leads a lot to what Jonathan Becker called cynicism, or can just become very cynical. I think another aspect of critical thinking has to be one, and another point about this is sort of like a God's eye position. It's sort of the critical thinker in the Bruegel painting, looking from above. I'm going to expose and show you. But not one who's engaged actively in community, who's working with others to rethink a vision of the world together. I think critical thinking comes from this idea, or in my mind, from a Greek word meaning to decide, to judge, to separate. These are political tasks that we do together. I think just my last point is, I wanted to get back to this question of creativity in critical thinking, Because as a political task, I think Andre sort of criticized this romantic image of creativity as just expressing yourself. And this is a very individual notion of creativity. It's what the individual, how he or she just sort of expresses themselves. And then we have also a very individualized notion of critical thinking too, as it's something that I do whether I'm parking my car or whether I'm problem solving. How do we think about these two tasks maybe more politically, or think about how creativity is something that we do in tandem or in conjunction with others in the classroom? And we teach creativity not as self-expression, but critical thinking and creativity together as working and sort of rubbing against one another in the classroom to think about better worlds. Because critical thinking for me, and this is my last point, is not just mere like naysaying or cynical, pointing out the bad things. It's about thinking about what can be known, that sort of Kant's point, what must be done, and what may be hoped for. And all three of these tasks sort of have to go together, I think. But that's it.
All right. Thank you very much. So, who wants to be next? For those who haven't talked yet. Yeah, Calvin, please.
Hello. I wanted really to echo a few points made by Zach, because I've been writing a project about responses to the financial crisis in 2008, and I find that in a lot of the writing on this topic, people say, well, we can't really understand the 2008 financial crisis outside of a much bigger crisis, which has all kinds of dimensions, which is economic, ecological, moral, etc., etc., etc. And this very often leads to reflection on the origin of the word crisis, which is closely related to critique. And as Zach points out, the ancient Greek here is selection, selection, distinguishing, deciding. This is what the Greeks understand by to critique something. And therefore what a crisis is in the original metaphor is a medical understanding, which is to say that there is an uncertain process of an illness, and at some point in the critical phase, there has to be a decision or a prognosis or a diagnosis from which you can exit from this crisis. In one or two of the texts that I've been looking at, they describe how this metaphor has evolved from a medical, in its origin, a medical metaphor to how we come to understand time more generally. So in the 18th century, crisis becomes not simply an illness, but any kind of period of profound trouble, often political trouble. And which kind of brings us to the present day, where some of these writers are saying that our time is a crisis, but it's a kind of a permanent crisis, or it's a crisis that we can't get out of, that there is no critique. And this usually connects with arguments such as that we've lost critical thinking. We cannot arrive at this decision. So I suppose that's a kind of a more metaphysical argument, if you like. Yeah, so I'll offer you that thought.
Thank you. I think we have two more people who haven't spoken yet, right? Dara and Natalia. All right.
Oh, the chair is actually more comfortable than it looks. So I don't work at one university, and neither do I study at one university, and instead I belong to this Skolkovo group of nomads. We travel from one place to another, and we watch universities develop their liberal education, and I listen to them talk about critical thinking now and then. and I become haunted by the idea that critical thinking is just not enough anymore. And if you try to observe people, you'll arrive at the same conclusion because, well, say you know the patterns you fall into, you know the mistakes, but are you vigilant? Do you really do what you think is reasonable? Does anyone, do states do what's reasonable? Do politicians do what's reasonable? So there's this scene at the movie called The Lake House by Alexandra Agresti, I think, done in 2006. So the main character, Alex Weiler, stands with his brother in the glass house, and they are looking at the lake, and they say that there is no connection between you and what you're observing. So I think that critical thinking has become this glass house that has to be broken. And higher education has to be something that breaks the glass house and allows us to go out and to rise from critical thinking to something that Ronald Barnett called critical action. So the idea is that when one should not just think critically, but also act critically. And what could it mean for the university? Firstly, university itself should become an actor, an entity that is sovereign from any existing epistemologies, which is always vigilant of whatever is happening around, and an entity that cannot stand idly by. So say if you're a university and your government has gone nuts, you should do something. You should not stand idly by. And if you see something that you don't like as the organization, you should act upon it. And going back to the government, better yet, why don't you make sure that that never happens by creating a school of public policy or a school of public administration and ensure that rational thinking is upheld somewhere. Now, at the level of students, we should strive for the same thing, basically. Universities should train students to emancipate themselves from cultural training, or any existing epistemological frameworks. Students should be able to question anything they see, and again, they should not be able to stand idly by if something that they don't like happens. They should strive for continuous optimization and actual change. So the point is, we cannot practice critical thinking by just practicing critical thinking. If it doesn't have the door to action, if it doesn't end in action, it doesn't happen. There is no proof that it has happened.
Okay, and Natalia, please.
Dear colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this topic with you. I will be more empirical in my speech, and I'm worker in the Center for Sociology of Higher Education, and one of the direction of our center and research direction is research in the student engagement and factors that affect academic outcomes. And we understand critical thinking skills as one of the academic outcomes that universities should provide, should develop. And why it is important, the institution of higher education in Russia put a lot of attention to factual material and to memorization of this factual material. But some empirical research showed that these have little impact on the future career and future life of students. So, and the conclusion here is that we should help students to be successful in the future and help them to be lifelong learning in order to be able to be successful in the changing world. So, and critical thinking is considered as one of the component of skills that students need to be lifelong learners. So, and according to researchers who emphasize the need of critical thinking in lifelong learning, we understand critical thinking as ability to identify central issues and assumptions in an argument, recognize important relationships, make correct inference from data, and other activities that can be operationalized and can be observed in behavior in some activities of students. So, and the next slide I dedicated to some empirical evidence about how we can organize the curriculum and learning in universities in order to emphasize critical thinking skills. I should mention here that there are weak correlation between critical thinking skills and grades. It was observed in some empirical research, and there are weak correlation between some interventions in instructions and in class and development and gains in critical thinking skills. There are a lot of work that should be done in order to understand how we can enhance critical thinking in university, but today we have some evidence that we can use in order to enrich educational process, enrich educational environment in university. So the most important is student engagement and work of instructors in order to enhance student engagement, participation in a process, enhance interactions between students in classes, and encourage some new ideas and use these ideas in order to students understand that these ideas is important in order to get some positive experience from the process of critical thinking. So, and according to the most famous researcher in the field of student experience and factors determine academic outcomes, Terenzini and Pascarella, we can see some fields that university can affect. So we can affect student pre-college traits by procedure of admission or selection, but most important is the coursework and curricular out-of-classes experience that can be organized by universities and classroom experience. So it's my points to this forum. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So what I think we should do next is, first of all, we're going to have lunch, right? So while we are having lunch, and let's have, do we need 1 hour? I guess we need 1 hour. Let's spend 1 hour for lunch. While we are having lunch, I encourage everybody to start discussing the topics of the 3 teams we're actually going to get together and in the afternoon, right? So after lunch, so let's say at 3 o'clock, we get together here and we actually decide on the teams and people sign up for the teams. But I don't have, I mean, I have some ideas which actually emerged from the discussion, but you probably have your own ideas. So just come up with some hypothesis of the topics that you think would be interesting to get 5 people, for example, from us to discuss in depth and to come to some kind of deeper observation that it was possible in this format, right? And so we get together here at 3 o'clock and decide.